Hi, Bassam.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm fine.
Okay, well, you're coming to us from Gaza, and this is a Blogging Heads First. We've never had anybody from Gaza, but I wanted to get a perspective from Gaza because it's not easy for Western journalists to get into Gaza, and that's one reason that I think Americans don't have a very clear idea of what's going on there. So before we get a picture from you of life in Gaza, why don't we tell people who you are? Your name is Bassam Nasser, and I got in touch with you because we have a mutual friend, and I think you work at the Catholic Relief Services there in Gaza. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, I'm the field manager of Catholic Relief Service, and I was born in Gaza. I lived my life here. I studied in the West Bank at Najah University, and then I followed my studies with masters at the Tel Aviv University. And during my life, I was able to visit the U.S. 3 times, including one scholarship to the University of Minnesota as part of the Humphrey program.
I've been to the Humphrey School in Minnesota. Okay, you know, one thing that got my attention when we tried to arrange this is that you said there were certain times of day when it might not be a good idea to take because there was more of a chance that you would have no electricity. And I gather this is kind of a common feature of life in Gaza is uncertainty about when you will and will not have electricity in any given day?
Well, actually, at the moment, we live with electricity on a schedule of about at least 12 hours cut. So you have to manage yourself and your work for not having electricity half of the day. And it works in a schedule in a way of like if you receive electricity today, you probably will not receive it tomorrow at that same time. This is why I said to you Wednesday would be perfect because Tuesday we did not have electricity at the time of morning East Coast time. So my guess was right, and now we have electricity. And for this interview, if all of a sudden the electricity went off, then we will not face that big of a problem since we are recording on a laptop. But other parts of life are totally shut down or managed in a way that you manage yourself to work, to live on the time when you have electricity, or as almost everybody in Gaza is doing, by a generator. I have a generator in my apartment. It's not very safe, but I almost have no choice.
Mm-hmm. And what is it hasn't always been like this in Gaza, I take it.
It has been the same since a few years when the Israelis bombed with airstrikes the only power plants in Gaza. Gaza receives electricity about 75% from Israel, buy electricity from Israel, and generates almost 30% of the need. The only power station in Gaza is managed on industrial fuel that comes via Israel, and the Israelis are using this to control the work of that power station. They also control it by not allowing spare parts to enter, and of course by bombing that at once. At one side, they are not allowing Gaza to receive enough electricity through Israel. On the other side, they are not allowing Gazans to have their own power station run to full capacity and provide the needed electricity to businesses and homes in Gaza.
Wait, you mean you have a functioning power station that could be providing the needs, and they're not allowing you to do that, or what?
We have a power station that can run to the maximum and provide all the need. The Israelis are not allowing the entry of spare parts and major technical parts needed for the power station to run to the maximum
this is part
capacity.
Of the blockade?
Yes, the power station works on turbines. The Israelis are allowing only 2 turbines to run, and not allowing 4 other turbines. So it is it's all in their hands, similar to almost every aspect of life in Gaza. It is totally in the hands of the Israelis. They decided what we eat and what type of water do we drink, and they decide what type of air do we breathe even in Gaza.
So the blockade, then the economic blockade that this is part of, I guess goes back to maybe 2006 or 2007. But anyway, I gather it begins when does it begin when Hamas seized control? I mean, just a little bit of background. There was, of course, this election in 2006, Palestinian election. Hamas was allowed to participate, but when they actually won the election, the United States and Israel and the European Union found that unsatisfactory and kept them from actually having practical control of the Palestinian Authority, which was supposed to happen with the winner of the election, I guess. And in response, Hamas violently seized control of Gaza, whereas Fatah, the rival organization, remains in control of the West Bank. But now Hamas has control of Gaza, and I gather that, I mean, first of all, you can correct me if I got any of that wrong, but I gather that the economic blockade is itself a response to the political control that Hamas exercises and perhaps some of their other behavior.
Well, let me first say that I don't agree it is an economic blockade. It is a total blockade. What's the relation of economic to not allowing the entry of journalists to Gaza, or allowing that under full restrictions of Israeli control?
Just to interrupt, journalists, I gather, can get into Gaza, but they have to get the permission of the Israeli military, and that's a kind of elaborate process, and it involves agreeing. And
it's also related to a certain period of time. You know, a few months before the Israeli war in Gaza in December 2008, January 2009, journalists were totally not allowed to enter Gaza, and during the war there were not any foreign journalists inside Gaza during the war. But let me just touch on that. It's not only economic, it's everything. Why pasta is not allowed to enter Gaza? Why certain types of food that has nothing to do with explosives are not allowed to enter Gaza? Why Palestinians who hold Palestinian IDs are not allowed to enter Gaza when they wish to? So it's not only economic, it's not only construction materials, cement or other items that they believe it's going to help Hamas maintain control of Gaza. On the other hand, so the blockade existed with the existence of the occupation 1967. It went with like waves, ups and downs. When the Israelis were in charge of Gaza, of course it was not as hard as it is today. And when the Palestinian Authority started in the early 90s, it was also easier than these days. Strict blockade on Gaza, as you said, started after Hamas took over Gaza and later kidnapped or the abducted Israeli soldier inside Gaza. So today the Israelis are saying that everything related to the closure of Gaza is related directly to the release of the Israeli soldier. Release the soldier and
this
is open the blockade.
Gilad
Yes.
Shalit, I think?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
This is how the Israelis put it. So release the soldier and we will open the borders.
Okay, and what effect does this have on public sentiment in Gaza? I mean, I think part of the idea, from Israel's point of view, the idea of things like this is partly, I think they hope that they can convince the people in Gaza that this is Hamas's fault. I think that was somewhat the idea behind the war in Gaza as well. And I'm wondering how that does, as a matter of fact, work out. To what extent do people blame Gaza for the blockade, and to what extent do they blame Israel? Or to put it another way, does it increase popular support for Hamas or decrease it?
Well, in my opinion, it doesn't give any credit to anyone. It is, first of all, the Palestinians are similar to any other people around the world. All what they look for is freedom and to live free. And I can say that we are sick of occupation. That's it. We are fed up of occupation, and we cannot accept any excuses of this occupation. That's it. And for us, accusing other parties does not put Israel in any position other than the main criminal of this blockade over Gaza, of the violations of basic human rights. So, this propaganda is not bought in Gaza. People do not buy it. People look to Hamas in a different perspective from the way they look to Israel. And I don't know any Palestinian, inside or outside Gaza, who have both Hamas and Israel somehow under the same scope or picture. The Israelis are responsible for this blockade on Gaza. The Israelis are responsible for 38 years occupation of inside Gaza, and then they are responsible for the ongoing closure over Gaza. Hamas is a different story. Hamas is an integral part of the Palestinian society. It's a political party. They participated in elections. They won the elections. The story you have known and you touched on. And the way they look to Hamas is totally different from the way they look to Israel. So the Israeli propaganda is not really accepted inside Gaza. When the Israelis were bombing, they were bombing everywhere inside Gaza. My home was directly damaged from the Israelis' attacks on Gaza, and I know that there was nothing around me, and I know that Hamas did not hide in that building when it was partly destroyed. There are people who were killed and targeted when they had no connection to Hamas. So that propaganda has no room inside Gaza, and I believe it has less and less supporters and people to buy it around the world. It does not work this way. The minute the principles accepted for civilians around the world shall be the only principles to be used for the Palestinian people and civilians inside Gaza. You cannot have certain principles for Palestinians and other principles for others. These principles are being used by the terrorists, and allow me to say that if this is accepted, then Bin Laden is also correct with all of his propaganda against the West and against the US and against the Europeans. If we say that, your people brought this punishment to you, we did that only because your people did so and so, then we are having that jungle rules. I am not responsible for the acts of anyone else other than myself. And that principle shall be treated and being imposed for Palestinians or for non-Palestinians. And Israel cannot...
Can I
Yes.
see if I understand you? Are you saying that if you are punished for the behavior of Hamas, that is like Osama bin Laden punishing innocent civilians for the behavior of the American government?
I am saying that allowing Israel to use this formula is opening the gate for anyone to use that formula on his own way. For me, this is totally unacceptable for anyone to use it. For me, I am innocent as a civilian and I shall not be punished because I was born here or my name has that reference. So for me, the principle of human rights is the most important. And for me,
you're talking about collective punishment as a...
It is absolutely collective punishment. Everything that's going on Gaza, like starting of the closure and determining what type of items are Palestinians in Gaza allowed to have. We are allowed to have yellow cheese, but we are not allowed to have white cheese. What this has to do with the kidnapped soldiers, what this has to do with Hamas ideology or Hamas winning the elections or losing the elections. Why Palestinians cannot even rebuild the homes that the Israelis themselves destroyed during the war. And the Israelis themselves admit that these are civilians and they are innocent. Why the hell can't they rebuild their homes? If they are not even asking for compensation, when the whole world understood and admitted that there were violations of the international law, there were attacks against civilians, and this, instead of enforcing Israel to open the blockade on Gaza, the international community simply is not doing enough, if not to say is doing nothing, is not doing enough to force Israel to leave that blockade and allow Palestinians to live freely, similar to any other people around the world.
Okay, now leaving aside this question of the morality of collective punishment or the legality of it, do you think it shows any signs of being effective? I mean, is there any chance that in the end, just looking at the politics within Gaza and attitudes within Gaza, is there any chance that this will lead Hamas to do what Israel wants, which I guess is, in the first instance, to release Gilad Shalit, and in the long run, of course, there are other things that Israel would like. But
it's actually the opposite, Bob. Like what the current situation allows Hamas, and speaking politics now, allows Hamas always to claim we never got a chance. As a political party, Hamas can now claim we never got a chance. Hamas was elected in January 2006. People voted for Hamas for many and various of reasons, but people did not vote because ideologically they are totally supporting Hamas. People voted because simply, like any other democracy, people vote for a change approach. When people are not happy with their current government, they vote for the components. It's simple. This is how it works in any other democracy. But the international community does not accept that principle to be transferred or allowed for Palestinians to use. So the international community, in fact, wanted me to have a democracy, but the international community wanted me to vote the way they want me to vote. I am not Hamas. I'm not Hamas speaker, and I have many issues of disagreement as a citizen living in Gaza, but still I do respect the right of Hamas to run in elections, and if Hamas ran in election and allowed to participate in that elections, that was absolutely completely supported by the international community, then the international community should have been taken accountable for accepting the results of that elections. It cannot be that we allow you to vote, but you have to vote the way we want you to vote. We will not accept the way you voted. And if you voted other than we want, then we will have a blockade. We will not fund you, we will not support you, and we will not recognize you. The international community did not even spoke to Hamas and said to them, oh, if you don't do so and so, we will not recognize you. They spoke to Hamas through media, while they speak to North Korea directly and they speak to Iran directly. And, in my opinion, this is a big contradiction.
What do you think might have resulted if the international community had spoken to Hamas right after the election and tried to get some reassurances that Hamas could live in peace with Israel, if they were going to indeed be the government of the Palestinian people? What position do you think Hamas might have been willing to take on that?
Well, first of all, I believe that some of the positions of Hamas, when speaking about Hamas versus Israel, are the position of the Palestinian people. Palestinian people want to end the occupation, and it's unified about this. Palestinian people.
Can I clarify one thing? You've referred a couple of times to the Palestinian people wanting to end the occupation. Now, some viewers will say, wait a second, the occupation of Gaza is over, and of course you're under another form of hardship now, but
it's not over.
I just want to clarify why it is that you keep using the term occupation.
Because occupation is not only a police force in the street. Occupation also means the skies, the water, the territory, the entry, the right to travel, the right to express yourself, the right to speak freely without being subjected to imprisonment if you go by. The occupation still control the border of Gaza. So you can also call any prison an independent territory. If Gaza is not occupied now, then also maybe Guantanamo is also an independent territory, and these prisoners in Guantanamo can be considered their own with that freaky nationality that God knows how to name it. We are under the occupation because Israel can control every aspect of my life, because Israel can cut electricity and can cut water and can bomb a bridge and can bomb electricity power station and can close the border and can ban pasta from entering Gaza and can ban milk or yogurt from entering Gaza. If this is not occupation, then maybe we have to look for something else as part of a definition. And when I refer to the Palestinian people, I refer to Palestinians who live in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, Palestinians inside Israel, and Palestinians in the diaspora. 1948, that problem was created by Israel and the international community. We still feel that unity of being Palestinians. We still belong to that piece of land and to the same history and heritage of the Palestinian people. This is how we call ourselves.
Okay, so there is one point you're making is there is a literal occupation still going on in outside of Gaza in the West Bank. Now I want to ask you about you said you have criticisms of Hamas. I'd like you to talk about those. But first I want to ask you, how free is someone in Gaza to criticize Hamas?
Well, Hamas took over Gaza in 2007. Currently, there are many tools that allows me to express that freedom are not available in Gaza. I do not receive newspapers because Palestinians newspapers because Hamas does not allow the three major newspapers issued in Ramallah and Jerusalem to reach Gaza. It's one of the issues of conflict in between the Palestinian Authority in charge of the West Bank and Hamas in charge of Gaza, because Hamas has two newspapers issued in Gaza and they want these newspapers to be allowed in the West Bank. I am not very much free to express my opinion. In Gaza there were people who were subjected to imprisonment or interviews or were asked to keep their mouths shut if they speak out. So I cannot speak about that great democracy that I live in inside Gaza. But as I indicated before, for me as a Palestinian, this is totally different from the occupation. These are two different separate files.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what? So Hamas does not let other Palestinian newspapers into the territory. What kinds of what does it exercise punishment on people who speak out against Hamas within Gaza? And I don't, of course, it's kind of a strange question to ask you, because if the actual answer is yes, it does punish people, then you may not be able to give me the actual answer. But anyway, without
I'll give you the answer. It's okay. Hamas does not allow the major component party, Fatah, to practice normal political life inside Gaza, and that's one of the major issues. So Hamas does not allow Fatah to conduct rallies, meetings, workshops, or conferences inside Gaza. Political life is not very much free for these political parties who disagree with Hamas, and again, always under the excuse that Hamas is not allowed to practice the same rights in the West Bank. So they are using that as a tool of pressure on the Palestinian Authority to allow their activists to work in the West Bank and to express themselves. Still there are I would say that mostly Gazans today can express themselves and can touch base on their political freedom mostly through the internet. I would say similar to this interview that we are having now. I know that journalists are not facing the same difficulties. They are not accompanied with the security forces when they move inside Gaza. I spoke to journalists before, and nobody ever asked me about comments I gave or issues I spoke about, and I did criticize the way they manage Gaza. But I believe that mostly I spoke to foreign media, mostly using English. I believe maybe they didn't know about it, but I would say that it would be the same if I was speaking to Arabic satellite channel criticizing the rulers of Gaza. I think that the actions might be different.
So you think, if I understand you correctly, you're saying it's easier to get away with criticizing Hamas in English for foreign media than it is to criticize Hamas in Arabic in a way that might, especially in a way that might come to the attention of Hamas or come to the attention of the people in Gaza?
Yeah.
Okay. So then you can speak fairly freely right now?
Yeah, I believe so.
And so what are your main criticisms of Hamas?
Well, for me, I do not accept the excuse of not getting a chance, because this is the major excuse Hamas uses these days. They use that for if we don't have freedom, we don't have any newspapers, as I said before. And why? Because they use the excuse of not being able to express the same rights in the West Bank, and not being free in the West Bank by the Palestinian Authority. For me, in principle, you cannot have an excuse for violating human rights and say, okay, because my human rights or my brother's human rights were violated, I will violate human rights of others. If your brother was kidnapped, you don't have the right to kidnap others or members of that other family. That's my main principle. Then, going into details of the daily life, I think that Hamas wants to remain in power despite the mismanagement they are having in Gaza. And today, if as a citizen living here, I think that people voted for them because people voted for change. And I think also one of the big criticism that I carry against them is that a certain vote that people took is not a guarantee forever that you will use. So people voted for you in 2006. It does not mean that you have a guarantee to remain in power until the judgment day. There are two choices. You either go for elections after 4 years according to the basic law of Palestine, or people will vote against you in a parliamentary procedure and remove you from power and go back to the ballot boxes and vote again, maybe vote for you again or to somebody else. Politically speaking, Hamas is taking the vote of 2006 as a guarantee that they were elected, but they forget that this democracy also have the ability to remove you from power and not only to get you to power. And these are the major issues. Like on the daily life, I think that they promised people much more than what they have achieved on the ground. Unfortunately, there is this closure. In my opinion, without the closure, they could have been under the scope of people, and people will evaluate it, would have been evaluating their performance with very much of a criticism. Unfortunately, the elections was supposed to take place in January 2006. So if the international community did not close or boycott Hamas or took all of these actions, if Israel did not close Gaza hermetically, we could have been 2 months ago or 3 months ago, we could have been in totally different situation, and people probably would have voted to a different party and removed Hamas from power, by using democracy, exactly the same way they got into power.
So now, do you have criticisms of Hamas's stance toward Israel? I mean, what Israel says about Hamas is, first of all, they don't acknowledge the right of Israel to exist even within the pre-1967 borders, and secondly, that in pursuing that position, they've used terrorism and have killed innocent civilians and so on. And then there are a whole range of, specific things like Shalit. Do you have any criticisms of Hamas's, what you might call its foreign policy, its policy toward Israel and the Western world?
Yeah, frankly speaking, I never put that in a evaluation form. How much do I agree and how much I would disagree with them? Simply because today there is a foreign minister of Israel who carry not even the same positions. He carry like harder position against my people, my own people.
This is Lieberman.
This is Lieberman, and will the international community boycotted Lieberman and did not spoke to him? But the international community said he got to power by a democracy, as the will of people. Why that same right is not being granted for Palestinians? So for me, why shall I recognize Israel without having Israel recognizing me and my history and my rights in that land? Why shall I be under that precondition, whether I'm Hamas or other than Hamas? And let's speak about the other party of Palestinians that recognized Israel, that worked for that Israel, that accepted Israel as existing in part of Palestine. What did they get? That's a question that Hamas always present to the Palestinian public, and it's a fair question. I disagree with them in principle, but unfortunately, this question is quite fair, and I totally agree with that question. Like, those who recognized Israel, what did they get? So you are supposed, as a Palestinians, you are being asked to recognize Israel, and we will grant you nothing, and we will not recognize you, and we will not we are the only people on earth who do not have a state. For God's sake, every tribe in Africa can decide and have their own state and country and being recognized by the international community. We are here before the Bible, and we did not get that right yet. We are not mature enough to get a state according to the international community. Then why shall we voluntarily come and recognize the state that was built on my home, on my blood, on my flesh? Why shall I do that? Why shall I do that voluntarily for nothing? Hamas is being promised nothing to do that. For doing that, they will speak to them. Yeah, wow. They were elected. The legitimacy of Hamas is as a Palestinian party. And again, I'm not a Hamas speaker. Their legitimacy is from the Palestinian people. They are a Palestinian party. Certain number, certain percentage of Palestinians voted for them, and we have to accept that. The way we accepted Lieberman on the other side.
So, first of all, just briefly, you mentioned your home. Is your family originally from what is now Israel?
Yeah. According to the United Nations Relief and Work Palestinian Refugees, my family is a refugee family, and I was granted that same title when I was born, and my children are granted that same title when they are born. I'm second generation, and I have children who are third generation of Palestinian refugees. My family moved from a village named Qatra. It used to be Muslim and Jews in that village. Currently, the name of the village was slightly changed into Gedera. Only the Jews remain, and the Muslim inhabitants of Gedera were forced to leave south and came to Gaza.
When did your parents leave? In the 1940s or when?
In the 1948, yeah.
Uh-huh. Okay, so back to this question of recognizing Israel's right to exist and Israel granting or the international community providing a state for the Palestinians. of course, I mean, both sides kind of say this. In other words, Israelis say, why should we give them a state if they won't acknowledge our right to exist? And then Palestinians say what you said. Suppose that you could be assured of a state, a real state of your own. Would you, I have two questions. Would you be willing to acknowledge Israel's right to exist, more or less within the 1967 borders? Probably as a practical matter, you'd have to have some land swaps. But suppose that the Palestinians fundamentally got East Jerusalem as part of their state, or much of it, and did land swap, and that was their capital, and they did land swaps. And some settlements in the West Bank were evacuated, and to the extent that they weren't evacuated, there were land swaps, so Palestinians would get land that is now within Israel proper. Suppose all that happened, could you live with that? I mean, at this point, is that what you would consider an acceptable outcome?
Well, first of all, let me say that the absolute majority of the Palestinian people are, they dream to live in peace. I don't know a person in my circle who wished to remain in conflict for the rest of his or her life. This is something that, it's not a choice. It's not a selection. We did not choose that. That type of life was enforced on us. I was born as a refugee. I did not choose to be a refugee. In principle, I want a just solution. That's the principle that I want. And in principle, and the way you just described, if you go back to that recording, you even touch base on settlers who moved to the West Bank. Some of them are moving to the West Bank right now. 2010, they moved to the West Bank, and you're sensitive to them, and you say, okay, removing of some settlements in the West Bank. But my people who were removed from their homes in 1948 and 70 years now as refugees, nobody is touching on that as a principle that must be changed. For me, there has to be a just solution. I want justice to be...
Would a just solution have to involve the movement of all settlers back within the 1967 borders? That's my question. Is it?
Well, why not? Then the question is, why not? If Palestinians were dragged of their homes as animals out of their homes in 1948, and today this is not an issue, today it's a state of Israel, and if I speak about my home today that existed in 1948, then I'm speaking about the destruction of the state of Israel, and I'm speaking against the human rights, against the international community. But if I say that, take that settler who came and lived in the West Bank because, he's making some sort of economical calculation. He can buy a house in the West Bank and get guards and get soldiers and get security and get his car being armed cars. Moving that settler back to Israel, where he still has a house, where he still has a state, where he is still recognized, is for some people this has to be temporarily or partly implemented. If this is the case, then why the case of Palestine is not brought into the international courts? And let's see, we either win or lose. If we lose, then the Israelis would have the right to remove us from the whole Holy Land. In my opinion, this is not. In my opinion, Palestinians shall get just solution for their tragedy. In my opinion, there has to be some kind of a recognition from the international community of that disaster that we have been living through. In my opinion, the international community should recognize that they have created a solution for the Jewish people on the blood of Palestinian people, on the land of Palestinian people. That old place is named also Palestine for me. And if I'm being asked to take in consideration that the rights of a few thousands of people, then why not to take in consideration the rights of millions of people, of Palestinians, who were not even granted the ability to come and visit their home, to come and visit their family. Palestinian people was cut into pieces and thrown all over the world because somebody decided to make a solution for the Jewish people in Palestine. Today, the majority of Palestinians are saying we are ready to go for a compromise. We are ready to go and share that homeland. But we have to take the whole piece of land that was occupied in 1967. Exactly as it happened with Egypt, exactly as the Syrians are proposing, and exactly as they did with Lebanon, with no peace solution, with no peace agreement.
So you're asking for a total withdrawal of all the settlements, and do you think that that is what most of the Palestinian people would insist on?
That's the minimum that Palestinians can agree on. And this is very important for the international community to understand. We have to change history. We have to tell our children, why did we give up the land of our parents? I'm not speaking about a land promised to me like a few thousands of years. I'm speaking about the land that if I go to court today against the Israeli government, I can prove that my parents own that land, own that home. It's not a dream, it's not a history, it's not something I wrote from book, it's not something I brought to you because you believe in that ideology or not. I can prove to you that that little piece of land over there in that village is owned by my family. And why I'm not allowed to go back there.
Right, now that's a kind of a separate issue. That's the right of return, which is another contentious issue. But if I could just ask one more question about your view of the Palestinian people. You're probably familiar with the kinds of things they were talking about at Camp David in 2000 and then subsequently in Taba in Egypt when they continued the discussion. And there the idea was, okay, some of these settlements are going to stay, but whenever a settlement well, I don't know, actually, we don't know exactly what the details of that were, but if the idea was, in those cases where a settlement has to stay in the West Bank, then we have to give the Palestinian people, we have to carve out a piece of turf in Israel, in other words, within the Israeli 1967 borders, and give that to the Palestinian people in compensation so that the total size of the Palestinian state is as big as it would be if you just stuck with the 1967 borders. Are you saying that you don't think the Palestinian people would find that acceptable?
Without touching on any part of discrimination, can I take Times Square in New York and give you a piece of land in Wyoming in return at the same size of it? Do you think the value of a square meter in Times Square in New York is the same value as like a square meter in Wyoming state? I like Wyoming. I don't have a problem, but it's just a question. Like they wanted to cut great parts of Jerusalem, and they wanted to have the right to cut the West Bank into pieces, and they wanted to have the right to go and make a very small stripe in the center of the West Bank and install that settlements in that center, and they wanted to put a right that colonial settlement is legitimized by the people who lived under the occupation. Doing all of that and say, okay, we will give you another, in return, we will give you a piece of land that's going to be attached to the Gaza Strip. It's a desert, according to some Palestinian sources. It never has the same value as that land in the West Bank. And again, like going back to principle, in the occupation is the start of the solution of peace in the Middle East. In the occupation, and it has to be as a principle, and it's not a gesture. No one is giving me a gesture by deciding, okay, we want to end the occupation. In my opinion, prime ministers and presidents and leaders of colonial countries who decided to end the occupation, only a few of them deserve to get like the Nobel Prize for doing that. But if people were part of that occupation, if people believed in that occupation and decided to end the occupation simply because it doesn't work very much, they do not deserve to be recognized as peacemaker. Those who shall be recognized as peacemakers are those who believe in ending the occupation, because no one shall live under occupation, because simply people are born equal and they have the right to live equally and freely. If we don't have this principle, if we just want to resolve the Palestinian question by enabling Palestinians to express their right here, but Without other right, maybe not very much, because this Israel is very sensitive. In my opinion, the solution must also include recognizing the Palestinians' right inside Israel, because these are historical rights. These are historical rights. This is important. Later on, if Palestinians are giving up that right of return, then they are giving that up, right of return, because they believe in peace, not because they cannot do that, not because the international community enforced them to do that.
Let me ask you one more question about Israel, and then I want to talk a little more about life in Gaza under Hamas. But the question is about what is called the one-state solution. And there's more and more talk of the one-state solution in America, at least. I think Israelis find it kind of an alarming concept. The idea, well, the long-term idea, for those who are optimistic about it, the idea is that if you just defined all of Israel and the occupied territory as a single nation and gave all the Palestinians the right to vote in these elections, that, the optimistic scenario is that would work out okay, and the Israelis and Palestinians could get along, and it wouldn't turn into some kind of civil war or something. And then related to that, what some people in America kind of don't understand is why that isn't more of the focus of Palestinian activism. In other words, why don't Palestinians say, look, all we're asking for is the vote. We're not saying, you have to give us back any particular land or anything. We concede, let's just say this is one big piece of territory. We just want the right to vote. What are your thoughts on the one-state solution?
The ones, first, why it's not very popular among Palestinians, simply because people did not advocate for the one-state solution, and there has been Palestinians in general, when they speak about religion, I don't hear people speaking about discrimination. So when we speak about Palestinians, we are certainly today speaking about Muslims and Christian Palestinians. They are under the same occupation and they face the same restrictions.
Right. So I'm not sure I understood when you said the reason they don't like the idea is because people haven't advocated for it. You mean?
Yeah, like for Palestinians, there has been always the question of occupation, and later on the proposal that came from outside were always related to creating a Palestinian independent state, and this became the dream of Palestinians, actually, to build their own state. But I am one of those who believe that there has to be a solution, and one of the ways of resolving the conflict here is actually by creating or allowing the one-state solution, where your citizenship is the key for your existence in that state, and not your religion background. Your citizenship, your rights and duties for that state. Unfortunately, lately the Israelis has been speaking more and more of Palestinians on a condition on Palestinians to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. So they are speaking about confiscating the rights of those who are non-Jews in that state. But why Palestinians are not supporting that? Because they think that it's not realistic. It's not very much realistic because of the power of Israel. That Israel will always reject that and will never accept that. But they believe that Israel might be very interested of getting rid of the inhabitants of the West Bank and Gaza, or the control of these inhabitants, not the land. Because if they integrated these inhabitants into Israel, then the whole idea of a Jewish state will vanish within 10 years or 20 years.
But I think among people who advocate the idea in the United States, one of the scenarios is certainly not that Israel would immediately grow enthusiastic about the idea. I think the idea is that if Palestinians peacefully demonstrated and said all they want is the right to vote in elections for the government that in fact controls their lives, then that would gain a lot of international support. And then one of two things would happen. There would be more and more pressure on Israel to grant Palestinians a vote. And I think then there are two ideas. One is that, well, maybe eventually a one-state solution would happen. But the other idea, which I think is kind of more interesting, is that Israel would grow so concerned about the one-state solution that they would start offering more generous terms for a two-state solution.
Yeah.
Have you heard that idea?
Yeah, I think so. In my
why
opinion,
is this happening? Why aren't any Palestinians? If this idea makes sense, why aren't Palestinians organizing to peacefully demonstrate for the vote?
Well, Palestinian, actually, like the currently Palestinians are physically divided from Israelis. So it's not that Palestinians are living somehow together, but they don't have the right. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are hermetically divided from the Israelis. They are not in touch. They don't see each other. The two peoples are totally separated. So, like in action, getting a one-state solution shall be brought by removing the wall. It cannot be enforced by non-violent acts on Israel. It shall be. It must come as a decision from above, and Palestinians believe it cannot work as a decision from above simply because Israel will oppose it. Israel is not interested of having that solution. And on the other side, I think that the Palestinian Authority has been threatening of taking that approach, and has been receiving very much of strong reaction from the international community that if the Palestinian Authority will take that approach, then the international community will immediately cut all type of fund and support for that Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority
I heard that. Do you know who they're hearing that from in particular?
No,
from
I
America?
don't. No, I think that the Palestinian Authority, I hear that from several speakers of the Palestinian Authority, that they threaten to go to that approach because they know that this approach is the same, almost the same, of going with war against Israel or declaring war on Israel. Actually,
I see it almost as the opposite, in the sense that it would involve the disavowal of violence, but and also I would emphasize again, some people see it not leading ultimately to a one-state solution, but rather to a two-state solution that Palestinians would consider more equitable. But let me. We don't have that much time left. Let me get back to the domestic situation there. You mentioned that Palestinians include Muslims and Christians. Now, first of all, I actually have not asked you what your religion is. I don't know whether you're a Muslim or Christian. You don't have to say if you don't want to, but if you want to say, you can.
You can tell from my name. I'm a Muslim.
You're a Muslim. So I should, if I knew more, I would be able to tell from your name, which I don't. So,
like if I give you my full name, it will tell.
I'm sorry?
If I give you my full name, like my name is Bassam Nasser, then it
would have been a clue.
Yeah.
Muhammad is your middle name and not Jesus. That would have been.
It's my father's name. Yeah.
Okay. How does what is Hamas's stance toward Christians? Do they allow Christians to worship in Gaza, or do they?
Yeah, I work for the Catholic Relief Service, and I'm not going to speak about my work, but simply the life in between Muslim and Christians in Palestine is something that we are proud of. We don't have a problem. We don't have an internal problem. There were incidents that we are not very much proud of. There were incidents of one incident of target killing against a Christian young man that was completely criticized and rejected by the community, by leaders. And I know that, all of the, speaking of Hamas, they don't have these actions or thoughts against the Christian community. Mm-hmm. The Christian community of Gaza is less than 3%, but there are 4 Christian schools in Gaza, the majority of students are Muslims. They go to these schools because of the quality of education. But simply speaking, like inside Gaza and inside Palestine in general, I don't see that type of discrimination. People just live together for...
What about on the economic front? Does Hamas control a lot of jobs? In other words, is that one instrument of influence that Hamas uses, that if you want to get a job, you want to be supportive of Hamas, and if you're not supportive of Hamas, you'll have a harder time getting a job?
Well, currently in Gaza, even there is a situation, even if you are a supporter of Hamas, you may not get a job.
But does it help to get a job?
Yes,
if
of
you're
course. Of course it does. Hamas in Gaza, Hamas is the biggest employer. The Palestinian Authority, managed from Ramallah, is one of the big employers, and UNRWA is the third big employer. If we divide the Palestinian Authority in between Fatah and Hamas. So UNRWA is the second employer. We speak about the small businesses sector that collapsed at some point. Only tunnel business works in Gaza, but raw materials are not allowed to Gaza, so small businesses do not exist. Some of these people have lost everything. Some of the factories have been stopped since years, and then during the war, Israel came and destroyed the facility to make sure that destruction is going to be completed. But yes, Hamas controls the jobs, and Hamas is the biggest employer. And to give you an example, like a few months ago, Hamas announced recruiting policemen, and tens of thousands of people applied for this, despite the hard conditions of work of these policemen. And that announcement that included that these people will work for 6 months on volunteer basis. They will not be paid, and their work will be evaluated after 6 months. So they were putting barriers, but still, people without very much of a hope from the other side applied for that.
So in that sense, does the blockade actually makes people more dependent economically on Hamas? In other words, if the blockade were lifted, and presumably there were more kind of free enterprise, then Hamas would have less economic power, or is that wrong?
Yeah, I can give you an example. Like the blockade enabled Hamas to become in complete control of everything in Gaza. Before the blockade and before Hamas took over Gaza, there was this free economic relations between Gaza and Israel, and simply merchants in Gaza has direct deals and business with Israeli merchants, and people used to get their import stuff through Israeli ports. Currently, it is totally closed, the relation to Israel, and anything that entered Gaza through the tunnels, and Hamas has complete control over these tunnels. They own some, and they control the rest. Just in this last week, Hamas imposed a tax on cigarettes. So every box of cigarettes being dealt or traded in Gaza will have to pay a tax for Hamas government. Of course, they have full control. They have the ability to do that. If these cigarettes are imported through the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, then people will claim, why shall we pay tax twice? But so like closing Gaza and enabling goods or commodities to enter mostly only through the tunnels will enable Hamas to have greater control over that.
Okay, and the last question is, you talked about the fact that it's not always that Hamas, you might say, to say the least, discourages certain kinds of criticism there in Gaza, and there are views that it doesn't want expressed. Are some of those views what Westerners would consider more extreme than Hamas's? In other words, does it have rivals for power in Gaza who actually want it to take a more violent or more radical approach toward Israel?
Well, I wouldn't say toward Israel. As I told you before, like more of the radical Islamic group have the same background and the same approach of speaking about Israel. But there are more radical groups who criticize Hamas for participating in the elections, and and for that they wanted to continue being in the opposition and work against the occupation and not being involved in that elections. So yes, I would say that Hamas' greater challenge these days is to deal with some of the groups that has been growing inside Gaza, who believe that we are getting nothing from this political process, and simply we have to go back into opposition. And of course, these people has nothing to propose. We are speaking about some radical groups who propose only violence, and Hamas has been in a situation of, I would say, fighting some of these groups hardly. So part of the challenge for Hamas are some radical groups other than the moderate Fatah in the West Bank.
And so some of the missiles sometimes that get fired into Israel are actually fired by people other than Hamas. At least that is what's reported. And your impression is that sometimes Hamas is actually trying to stop that and is unable to, or not?
Yeah, Hamas actually, since the war, I would say the rockets, throwing rockets into Israel has not been an actual threat to the Israeli security. And that's also proof that the blockade in Gaza is not related to these rockets. Yeah. So now when there are no rockets, they are not opening that blockade. But Hamas, yes, Hamas is working hard to prevent that. So there is an unannounced ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Hamas forces can reach the border with the Israeli forces on the other side. I wouldn't say that they will say hi to each other, but they know that they exist on every side of the border. And for those in that business, what they want is having a calm border and calm situation. So there is an unannounced ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, despite what you hear in the media.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we've exceeded an hour, so we should probably stop. I could continue, and maybe someday we'll have a chance to. But thanks very much for taking the time, Bassam, and I'm glad that the electricity held up throughout this.